It was almost dawn when Laura finally left the hospital. The night shift had been long and heavy, one of those shifts that drained her to the bone but still left her mind too awake to rest. The sky was still a deep blue, holding on to the last bit of night before sunrise. The parking lot was almost empty. She could hear the quiet hum of the sea in the distance. The town was small and peaceful most of the time, and she liked driving through the empty roads before the world woke up. Her hands were sore from all the work she had done, but she didn't mind. Helping people was what she did best. It gave her a reason to get up every day. Still, there were moments when everything went quiet, that she felt something missing inside her, something she couldn't name. She started the engine and turned on the radio, keeping the volume low. The soft voice of the announcer talked about the coming rain and the cool breeze rolling in from the ocean. She smiled to herself. Rain always calmed her. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet. She rolled the window down and let the cold air brush against her face. The world felt still and safe for a moment, but peace rarely lasted long in her life. As she turned onto the narrow coastal road, she saw headlights far ahead. A small car was weaving slightly from side to side. At first, she thought the driver was just tired, maybe distracted. But a second later, the car swerved sharply and shot off the road, disappearing into the dark. Her heart jumped. She slowed down, scanning the side of the road. The beam of her headlights caught the broken fence and the marks on the wet ground. Then she saw it. The car had crashed into a ditch below near the rocks. Without thinking, she pulled over and grabbed the emergency kit she always kept in her back seat. Her training kicked in before fear could. She ran down the slope, careful not to slip on the damp grass. The smell of gasoline hit her before she reached the car. The vehicle was turned slightly on its side. The windshield was cracked and the driver's airbag had gone off. Inside, she could see a man slumped over the steering wheel, his head tilted forward. The radio was still on, playing a slow, sad song that seemed to echo through the quiet air. "Sir, can you hear me?" she called out as she reached the car. No answer. She tried the door when it was jammed. She grabbed a small flashlight from her pocket and shone it inside. The man looked pale, his chest rising and falling faintly. He was still alive. Relief washed through her. Laura stepped back, trying to think fast. The front passenger window had shattered, leaving a small opening. She took off her jacket, wrapped it around her hand, and broke off the remaining glass. She leaned in through the space, trying not to breathe too much of the gasoline fumes. "Sir, stay with me. I'm here to help you," she said softly. She touched his shoulder gently, but he didn't move. She reached for his pulse, and it was weak but steady. He needed to get out before anything worse happened. The smell of fuel was strong, and she could see smoke starting to rise from under the hood. Her chest tightened with fear, but she didn't step back. She unbuckled his seatbelt carefully, then pulled at the door again. It creaked but didn't move. Her heart raced. She looked around quickly, spotting a long piece of metal near the ditch, probably part of the fence that had broken during the crash. She grabbed it and used it as leverage against the door. With a heavy groan, the door gave way. She felt a rush of cold air as it opened. The man's head rolled slightly and a soft groan escaped his lips. He was alive. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're going to be all right." She slid her arm behind his shoulders and gently helped him lean back. He was heavier than she expected, his jacket damp from the rain. Slowly, she pulled him out, one movement at a time until he was lying on the grass outside. She checked his breathing again. It was shallow, uneven. She tilted his head back slightly and made sure his airway was clear. A small cut on his forehead bled steadily, but it didn't look deep. Sirens were still far away. She couldn't hear any yet. She pulled her phone out, called emergency services, and gave them the location. The operator told her help was on the way. The wind had picked up now, and the first drops of rain began to fall. She took off her sweater and covered the man with it, trying to keep him warm. For a moment, she sat beside him in silence, listening to the waves crash in the distance. She wondered what had happened to him. Was he rushing somewhere, or had something driven him off the road? He stirred a little, opening his eyes halfway. "What happened?" he whispered. "You had an accident," she said gently. "You're safe now. Just stay still, okay? Help is coming." He blinked a few times, looking confused. His eyes tried to focus on her face, then drifted away again. She could tell he was fighting to stay awake, but his body was too weak. She checked his pulse again and noticed how cold his skin felt. She rubbed his hands, trying to bring back some warmth. "You're doing great," she said quietly, more to keep him calm than anything else. "Just keep breathing." The rain began to fall harder, soaking her hair and clothes. Her fingers were shaking from the cold, but she didn't care. She stayed right there, watching over him. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, she saw flashing lights in the distance. Relief flooded through her as the sound of sirens grew louder. The ambulance pulled up near the broken fence, and 2 paramedics climbed down quickly. "What do we have here?" one of them asked. "Male, mid-30s maybe," Laura said, her voice steady though her teeth chattered. "He was unconscious when I got here. Breathing's weak, possible head injury." The paramedics nodded and took over, checking his vitals and preparing a stretcher. One of them looked at her and said, "You did good. You probably saved his life." She nodded, stepping back as they lifted the man carefully. Her knees felt weak now that the rush of adrenaline was fading. Once they loaded him into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to her. "You should get checked too. You're bleeding a bit on your arm." She looked down and saw a thin line of blood where a piece of glass had nicked her skin. "It's nothing," she said with a small smile. "I'll be fine." The paramedic gave her a look that said he wasn't convinced, but he didn't push it. She watched as the ambulance drove away, red and blue lights fading into the misty dawn. The rain kept falling, washing the dirt and blood off her hands. She finally let out a long breath. The wrecked car sat silent now, smoke gone, just a broken machine left behind. She felt a strange pull in her chest. Not sadness exactly, but something close. She turned back toward her own car, shivering from the cold. As she drove home, the sky slowly lightened and the first glow of sunrise painted the horizon. The road was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But Laura couldn't stop thinking about the man she had just saved. His pale face, the faint sound of his voice asking what happened. It stayed in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. She didn't know his name or why he had been on that road, but she felt connected to him somehow. Maybe it was just the way life reminded her that even strangers could cross paths for a reason. When she finally reached home, she sat in her car for a moment before going inside. Her hands were trembling and her eyes felt heavy. The house was quiet, smelling faintly of coffee from the morning before. She washed her hands slowly, watching the red water swirl down the sink. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired but calm. She didn't know that the man she had pulled from the wreck would soon change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. For now, all she knew was that she had done what she always did. She had tried to save a life. But she had no idea that in doing so, she had already started saving her own. Laura woke up the next morning to the soft sound of rain tapping against her window. The world outside was gray and quiet. For a few moments she didn't move, lying still under the blanket and staring at the ceiling. Her body felt heavy, the kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep but from something deeper. Memories from the night before began to replay in her mind. The crash, the smell of gasoline, the man's pale face, his faint voice. It almost felt like a dream, but the small cut on her arm reminded her it was all real. She rubbed it gently, then got up. The coffee machine hummed as she filled a mug and leaned against the counter. The taste of coffee was warm and bitter, but it did little to chase away the uneasy feeling in her chest. She couldn't stop wondering about the man she had pulled from the wreck. Was he all right? Had he made it through the night? She grabbed her phone and looked at the local hospital number. After a few seconds of hesitation, she called. "Hi," she said when a nurse answered. "I brought in a man from a car accident last night. I just wanted to know if he's okay." The nurse asked for a few details, then paused before replying. "He's stable now. A few bruises, some minor injuries, but he's going to be all right." Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. "That's good to hear," she said softly. "Did you know him?" The nurse asked. "No," she replied, "just happened to be there." "Well, you were lucky to be," the nurse said kindly. "If you hadn't stopped, it might have ended differently." After hanging up, Laura sat quietly for a while, watching the rain slide down the glass. She should have felt proud, maybe even happy. But instead she felt strangely empty. It wasn't the first time she had saved someone. She was a nurse after all. But something about this was different. Later that afternoon, when she went in for her shift, her co-workers greeted her with tired smiles. The hospital hall smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, like always. Her friend and fellow nurse, Helen, walked over, handing her a clipboard. "You made the news, you know," she said, raising an eyebrow. "What?" Laura looked up in surprise. "The accident," Helen said. "They mentioned that a nurse stopped and helped before the ambulance arrived. That's you, right?" Laura laughed softly. "Guess so. I didn't think anyone noticed." "Well, they did. You're kind of a hero this week." "I just did what anyone else would do," Laura said. Helen shook her head. "That's what all heroes say." The day went by quickly, filled with the usual rush of patients, ringing phones, and endless charts. But every now and then, Laura found her thoughts drifting back to the man from the accident. Later that evening, when her shift ended, she found herself walking toward the recovery ward almost without thinking. She told herself she just wanted to make sure he was okay. Nothing more. When she reached his room, she paused at the doorway. The man was sitting up in bed, a bandage on his forehead, his arm in a sling. He looked tired but alert, his eyes focused on the rain outside the window. She knocked gently on the doorframe. "Hi," she said with a small smile. "How are you feeling?" He turned, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment he looked puzzled, then recognition dawned on his face. "You," he said softly. "You were there," she nodded. "Yeah, I'm Laura. I work here at the hospital. I just wanted to check in and see how you were doing." He smiled faintly. "You saved my life." "You make it sound dramatic," she said lightly. "I just helped you out of a bad spot." He chuckled, though it quickly turned into a cough. "Well, thank you. I don't remember much, but I remember your voice." Laura felt her cheeks warm slightly. "You gave us a scare, you know." He looked down at his hands, quiet for a moment. "I guess I did." There was something in his voice, a sadness she couldn't quite place. She didn't want to pry, so she changed the subject. "The doctor said you'll be fine after a bit of rest." "That's good," he said, his tone distant. "I wasn't sure I'd make it last night." "Lucky for both of us you did," she said with a smile. They talked for a few more minutes, mostly small talk. Before she left, he said, "I didn't even get to thank you properly." "You just did," she replied. "Rest now. That's the best thank you can give me." As she walked out, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, something he wasn't saying. But it wasn't her place to ask. Over the next few days, she kept working her shifts, but somehow she and the man, whose name she learned was Ethan, crossed paths again and again. Sometimes she'd bring him an extra cup of tea. Sometimes she'd stop by just to ask how his recovery was going. Each time he seemed a little stronger. He had a quiet, thoughtful way of speaking, as if he'd spent a lot of time alone with his thoughts. One afternoon, as she checked his chart, he said, "You know, before the accident, I was driving to the cliffs. I wasn't sure I was coming back." She froze for a second, her hand tightening on the clipboard. "You mean?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I wasn't thinking straight. I'd lost someone. My wife." Laura didn't know what to say. The room felt heavier now, the soft hum of the machines the only sound between them. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "That must have been hard." He looked at her, his eyes full of pain and regret. "It still is. I didn't even see the curve until it was too late." "Then, you were there." She took a quiet breath. "Maybe that means something." He gave a sad smile. "Maybe it does." After that day, their conversations grew a little deeper. He talked about his wife, how she had loved the sea, how they used to walk by the coast every evening. Laura listened, sometimes saying little, sometimes offering gentle words. She found herself opening up too, in small ways. She told him how she'd spent years taking care of others but had forgotten how to take care of herself. How the job sometimes left her feeling like she was running on empty. "It's easier to fix other people's pain than your own," she admitted once. He nodded. "Yeah, I know that feeling too well." The days passed, and soon Ethan was strong enough to leave. On the morning of his discharge, Laura found a small note left at the nurse's desk. It was from him. It read, "Thank you for giving me another chance to live. I hope one day I can do something good enough to deserve it." Laura read it twice, her throat tight. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. That night she drove home through the same road where the accident had happened. The fence had been repaired, the ditch cleaned up. Everything looked normal again, as if that night had never happened. But she knew better. She pulled over for a moment and stepped out of the car. The sea was calm now, the air cool and still. She thought about Ethan, how close he had come to losing everything, how close she had come to never finding this strange connection that now lived quietly in her heart. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing for sure. Saving him had changed her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was just moving through life out of habit. She felt awake, alive, and oddly hopeful. As she stood there, the wind brushed her hair and a small smile crossed her face. Maybe life had a way of bringing two broken souls together just when they needed it most. She took a deep breath, got back into her car and drove home somewhere far away. In another part of town, Ethan stood by his window, watching the rain fall, the same rain that had brought them both to that road. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And maybe that was enough for now. Days turned into weeks after Ethan left the hospital. Laura went back to her routine, but something in her had quietly changed. Life at the hospital was still busy. Patients came and went, alarms beeped, and the smell of sanitizer lingered everywhere. Yet whenever things slowed down, her thoughts drifted back to that night by the sea. She sometimes wondered where Ethan was now, whether he had really found a reason to keep going, or if the sadness in his eyes still lingered. She tried not to dwell on it too much, but it wasn't easy. There was something about saving someone's life that stayed with you, a bond invisible but strong. Her days were long. She worked double shifts, skipped lunch more often than she should, and told herself she was fine. But deep down she knew she wasn't. There were mornings when she woke up feeling dizzy, her heart racing for no reason. She blamed it on stress and caffeine. One evening, after finishing a 10-hour shift, she started feeling lightheaded while driving home. The world outside her car seemed to blur slightly. She rolled down the window, letting the cool air hit her face. It helped for a moment, but by the time she reached home, she could barely keep her eyes open. She sat on the couch, trying to steady her breathing. The room felt too quiet. Her hands were cold, and a strange pressure pressed against her chest. She tried to shake it off, telling herself she was just tired. When she finally crawled into bed, sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, replaying that night at the accident site. The gasoline, the smoke, the sharp sting in her arm. She remembered how close she'd been to the fumes. The thought flickered in her mind, but she pushed it away. The next morning, she woke up late and rushed to work, pretending nothing was wrong. But by noon, the dizziness returned. She was taking a patient's blood pressure when everything around her tilted. "Laura, are you okay?" one of her coworkers asked as she stumbled slightly. "I'm fine," she murmured, forcing a smile, but the room kept spinning. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. Her friend Helen frowned. "You don't look fine. Sit down, please." Before Laura could argue, her vision blurred completely and everything went dark. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying on a hospital bed. Her own hospital. The irony wasn't lost on her. Helen stood beside her, arms crossed but worry written all over her face. "You fainted," Helen said. "You've been out for a few minutes." Laura tried to sit up, but Helen stopped her. "Don't move too fast. The doctor's coming." A moment later, Dr. Patel, the physician on duty, walked in holding a clipboard. "Laura, what's going on with you?" he asked gently. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." "I'm just tired," she said, brushing it off. "It's nothing serious." He gave her a look that said he didn't believe her. "We ran a few quick tests," he said. "Your oxygen levels were lower than normal, and your blood pressure dropped suddenly. I'm ordering a full checkup." Laura frowned. "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is," he interrupted. "You've been exposed to some dangerous fumes during that car rescue, haven't you?" "I saw the report from that night." Her heart skipped a beat. "That was weeks ago." "Sometimes the effects take time," he said firmly. "You need to rest. I want you off duty until we get all your results." She sighed, realizing she couldn't argue her way out of this one. That night, as she lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling again, feeling the weight of her own body. For years, she had taken care of others, patients, coworkers, even strangers. But now she was the one being told to rest. It felt strange and unsettling. Days later, her test results came back. The doctor explained that she had mild lung irritation and chemical exposure from the fumes that night. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to need treatment and rest. She sat quietly as he spoke, realizing that while she had been trying to save someone else, she had unknowingly hurt herself in the process. When she got home, she made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to slow down. The silence of the house felt heavier than usual. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Without thinking too much, she opened her messages and typed, "Hi, this is Laura from the hospital. Just wanted to see how you've been." She stared at the screen for a moment before pressing send. A few hours later, her phone buzzed. It was a reply from Ethan. "Hi, Laura, I've been doing better. Painting again. How are you?" She smiled faintly. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a few seconds before she typed back, "Taking some forced rest, apparently. Seems I'm not as invincible as I thought." His reply came quickly. "Maybe it's life's way of slowing you down a little. You've done enough saving for now?" She laughed quietly to herself. "Maybe you're right," she wrote back. They started talking more often after that. Small messages at first, then longer ones. He told her about the paintings he was working on, how he was slowly finding peace through his art. She told him about the boredom of recovery and how strange it felt to be on the other side of care. One day, he sent her a photo of a painting. It was the coastline, with soft blue water and a small figure standing near the fence. "Does this look familiar?" he wrote. She stared at it for a long time. The painting captured that exact spot from the night of the accident. The figure looked like her, standing alone in the mist. "It's beautiful," she replied. "And yes, it feels very familiar." He sent another message. "I guess we both survived that night for a reason." Her eyes softened. "Maybe we did." Weeks went by and Laura started to feel better. Her breathing improved, her dizziness faded, and she began going on short walks by the sea. She liked watching the waves crash against the rocks, the air fresh and salty. It reminded her that life kept moving no matter what. One afternoon, while walking, she saw someone standing near the same broken fence that had been repaired months ago. As she got closer, she realized it was Ethan. He turned when he heard her footsteps, a smile spreading across his face. "I thought I might run into you here," he said. "I could say the same," she replied. They walked together along the path, the wind cool against their faces. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was calm, like two people who didn't need to fill the air with words. Finally, he said, "You know, after the accident, I thought a lot about what happened. I kept thinking it was bad luck, but maybe it wasn't." She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "Maybe it was life's way of stopping me, making me look around and realize there's still something worth living for." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes we have to break before we learn how to rebuild." He smiled softly. "You sound like you've been doing some rebuilding yourself." "I guess I have," she said, looking out at the waves. "It's strange. I thought I was helping you that night, but I think you ended up helping me too." They both laughed quietly. The sound of the sea filled the pauses between their words. As the sun dipped lower, they sat on a bench overlooking the water. He turned to her and said, "You ever think about how close we both came to not being here right now?" "All the time," she admitted. "But maybe that's what makes moments like this feel more real." He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Maybe we don't save people just to keep them alive. Maybe we save them so they can start living again." She looked at him, realizing how true that felt. When it was time to leave, they promised to meet again soon. As Laura walked back to her car, she felt something inside her settle. A quiet peace she hadn't felt in years. That night, as she sat by her window again, she thought about everything that had happened. The rescue, the collapse, the recovery, all of it had led her to this quiet understanding. She couldn't pour from an empty cup. To truly help others, she had to take care of herself too. For years, she had been running on kindness alone, giving every bit of herself to those in need. But now she understood that saving others meant nothing if she didn't learn how to save her own spirit along the way. She smiled, closed her eyes, and listened to the rain begin to fall again, soft and familiar, like a promise. The weeks that followed felt softer somehow. Laura noticed how the small things began to matter again. The sound of birds early in the morning, the way sunlight poured through her kitchen window, the simple comfort of breathing without feeling tired. Life had slowed down, and for once she didn't mind. Ethan had started coming by the hospital once in a while, mostly for follow-up visits, but sometimes just to say hello. He would bring her a coffee or a small drawing he had done. His quiet smile always seemed to calm her on the busiest days. One morning he appeared at the front desk with 2 paper cups of coffee and a bag of pastries. "Peace offering," he said when she looked surprised. "Peace for what?" she asked, smiling. "For making you worry about me," he replied. She laughed. "You don't need peace offerings for that. Just don't scare me again and we'll call it even." He grinned, and for a moment she noticed how different he looked now. Lighter, steadier. There was still sadness in his eyes, but it no longer defined him. They sat in the small courtyard outside the hospital, sipping coffee while the morning sun warmed their faces. "I'm starting a small art class next week," Ethan said, "at the community center. They asked me to teach people who've been through tough times." Laura's eyes brightened. "That's wonderful. You'll be good at it." "I hope so," he said softly. "It feels strange, you know. A few months ago, I didn't even want to wake up in the morning. Now I'm planning lessons for other people." "Life has its ways," she said with a smile. "Sometimes it gives us a reason when we least expect it." He looked at her then, his expression thoughtful. "And what about you, Laura? You've been back at work full-time, but are you really taking care of yourself?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm trying. It's harder than I thought. I'm so used to fixing everyone else that I forget how to rest." He nodded. "Maybe you need a reminder every now and then." That made her laugh. "Are you offering to be my reminder?" "Maybe I am," he said, smiling. The next few weeks they met often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks by the sea. It wasn't anything romantic, at least not in the usual sense. It was something quieter, built on understanding and shared silence. They didn't need to say much to feel connected. One evening after her shift, Laura found a small canvas wrapped in paper sitting by her locker. There was a note attached that read, "For when you forget to breathe." She unwrapped it and found a painting of calm waves under a pale blue sky. It was peaceful, simple, and beautiful. That night she hung it by her bed. When she couldn't sleep, she would look at it and feel her thoughts slow down. But just as life seemed to find its balance, something unexpected happened. It was a Thursday afternoon when Laura received a call from the community center. The woman on the phone sounded worried. "Hi, is this Laura? You're listed as Ethan's emergency contact." Her heart dropped. "Yes, this is Laura. What happened?" "He collapsed during his class," the woman said. "An ambulance is taking him to the hospital now." Laura didn't even remember the drive there. Her hands were shaking the whole time. When she arrived, she ran inside, scanning every hallway until she saw one of the nurses she knew. "He's in observation," the nurse said. "They think it's exhaustion. He's been pushing himself too hard." Laura exhaled slowly, her chest tight. She waited outside his room until she was allowed in. When she walked in, he was lying in bed, pale but awake. "You again?" he said with a faint smile. She shook her head, trying to hide her worry. "You scared me this time." "Guess we're even now," he murmured. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well," she said softly. He looked at her, his expression calm but tired. "I didn't think it was serious. I just wanted to keep going. I didn't want to waste time." She sat down beside his bed. "You're not wasting time by resting. You're human, remember?" He smiled weakly. "You sound like my nurse." "I am your nurse," she said, smiling back. They sat in silence for a while, the soft beeping of the monitor filling the room. Finally, he said, "You know, I used to think being alive wasn't enough, that if I wasn't doing something big, it didn't mean anything. But lying here, I realize it's the small things that matter, like sitting by the sea, or talking to you." Laura felt her throat tighten. "You've learned that faster than most people." "I had a good teacher," he said quietly. She looked away, blinking back the warmth in her eyes. Ethan stayed in the hospital for a couple of days. Laura visited whenever she could. When he was finally discharged, she drove him home. His apartment was small but cozy, filled with canvases and paintbrushes. Some of the paintings leaned against the wall unfinished but full of color. "You've been busy," she said, looking around. "It keeps me grounded," he replied. "Helps me understand things I can't say out loud." She smiled softly. "Art does that. It speaks when words can't," he nodded. "That's why I paint. To remember that even pain can turn into something beautiful." Before she left that day, he handed her a small envelope. "Don't open it until you get home," he said. She agreed. though curiosity burned inside her the whole drive back. When she finally sat down and opened it, she found a folded piece of paper with a short message. "You saved my life once, but every time you remind me to live, you save it again. Thank you." Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't sad tears. They were full of something deeper: gratitude, connection, quiet healing. The next few weeks, Laura took more time for herself. She began reading again, cooking simple meals, and visiting the sea every weekend. She even started sketching a little. Nothing like Ethan's art, but enough to remind her of calm. She still worked at the hospital, still cared deeply for her patients, but now she did it with a lighter heart. She no longer felt like she was running from something. She was walking toward something, peace maybe, or just a better version of herself. One Sunday morning, she and Ethan met again by the cliffs. The air was crisp and the ocean stretched endlessly before them. "You know," Ethan said, "I've been thinking about starting a project. A series of paintings about people who find light in dark places." She smiled. "Sounds like something you know well." "I was thinking of calling it Saved." "That's beautiful," she said softly. He glanced at her. "You'd be the first one in it." She laughed lightly, shaking her head. "I don't think I belong in a painting." "I disagree," he said. "Some people deserve to be remembered that way." They stood there for a long time, watching the waves crash against the rocks. Neither of them needed to speak. The silence said enough. Laura realized then that maybe saving someone wasn't always about pulling them from danger. Sometimes it was about reminding them, and yourself, that life was still worth showing up for. When she looked at Ethan, she didn't see the broken man from that night anymore. She saw someone who had rebuilt himself piece by piece, turning pain into purpose, and in her own reflection, in his eyes, in the water, in the quiet, she saw that she had done the same. That evening, when she returned home, she sat by her window again, holding a mug of tea. The painting Ethan had given her still hung on the wall. The waves in it seemed calmer now, as if time itself had healed them. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the sea through the open window. It was cool and fresh and full of promise. Laura closed her eyes and smiled. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about saving anyone. She was simply grateful for the life she had, for the people who crossed her path, and for the strange, beautiful way the world sometimes gave us back the very thing we thought we had lost. Months passed like pages of a quiet book. The world didn't change much around Laura, but something inside her had. She found herself smiling more often, laughing easily, even when days were long and tiring. The hospital still carried its share of chaos, but it no longer felt like it was swallowing her whole. She had learned to step outside, to breathe, to let life move at its own pace. Ethan's art class became a small success in the community. People from different walks of life came together, some recovering from grief, others from illness, a few just looking for a reason to smile again. Laura visited sometimes, quietly sitting in the back and watching. The laughter that filled the room always made her heart lighter. One afternoon, he handed her a small invitation card. "It's happening next week," he said, his tone calm but with a spark of excitement. "What's happening?" she asked. "My first gallery show," he said. "They offered me a space at the local art hall. I thought maybe you'd come." "Of course I'll come," she said without hesitation. He smiled with relief. "Good. It wouldn't feel right if you weren't there." The night of the exhibition came with cool air and soft lights. The hall was filled with people, murmuring gently as they moved from one painting to another. The walls were lined with Ethan's work, soft colors, deep shadows, waves, faces, and moments that seemed to carry entire stories in a single stroke. When Laura walked in, she froze for a moment. At the center of the room hung a large painting. It showed a woman standing near the sea, the wind blowing through her hair, her expression calm yet strong. Ethan came up beside her quietly. "That one's called The Healer," he said. Laura looked at him. "She looks peaceful." "She is," he said softly. "She reminds me of someone who saved more than just lives, someone who reminded others what it means to live." She didn't say anything for a while, afraid her voice might break. Instead, she smiled. "It's beautiful." He looked at her, his eyes kind. "You taught me how to see beauty again. That painting is my thank you." The room around them faded into quiet for a moment. Then someone called Ethan's name and he went to greet them. Laura stayed by the painting, staring at it. For the first time in a long while, she saw herself not through the lens of duty or exhaustion, but through grace. As the night went on, people came up to her too, asking if she was the nurse from the story. Apparently, Ethan had mentioned in a short speech that his art was inspired by a moment when someone saved him, and by how that act of kindness became a second chance for them both. Laura smiled politely, but inside she felt something warm spreading through her chest. It wasn't pride exactly. It was peace, a quiet understanding that sometimes the smallest choices can ripple far beyond what we can see. When the crowd thinned, Ethan found her again. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "You didn't have to thank me," she replied. "You've done something wonderful here." He hesitated, then said, "I couldn't have done it without you." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Maybe we saved each other in different ways." He smiled at that. "I like that version better." After the exhibition, life settled into its gentle rhythm again. Laura and Ethan continued to meet, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for long walks where they didn't need to talk much. The friendship they shared had deepened into something more rooted than either expected. Not a love defined by romance or need, but by presence. One weekend, they drove to the coast together. The same cliffs where they had stood months ago were now covered in wildflowers. They sat side by side, the sea stretching endlessly in front of them. "I think about that night sometimes," Ethan said quietly. Laura turned to him. "The night of the accident," he nodded. "Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago. I still can't believe how much has changed." "So much can happen in a year," she said softly. "Sometimes it takes one moment to change everything." He looked out at the waves. "You know what's strange? I used to see that night as the worst thing that ever happened to me, but now I see it as the night my life began again." Laura felt her throat tighten. "Funny," she said. "I feel the same." They sat quietly after that, watching the waves crash and pull away. The sky was wide and full of color, 1,000 shades of gold and blue. It felt like the world itself was exhaling. As evening came, they packed up and headed back toward the small town. The car ride was peaceful, the kind of silence that only happens when words aren't needed. In the months that followed, Laura began volunteering at the same community center where Ethan taught. She started a small group for people who were recovering from trauma or loss. Not therapy, just a space to talk, listen, and heal. She often told them, "You don't need to be completely fine to help someone else. Sometimes helping is what heals you." One afternoon, after a session, she sat by herself in the empty room looking out the window. The light was soft, the same kind of light that had filled her kitchen that first morning when life started to change. She smiled, realizing she wasn't the same person anymore. Later that week, Ethan stopped by with a new painting. It was smaller than the others, but full of meaning. It showed two figures walking along a shoreline, their reflections stretching across the wet sand. At the bottom, in small letters, he had written, "For all the lives we save without knowing." Laura hung it next to the first painting he had given her. Together, they made her small apartment feel like a gallery of hope. Seasons changed again. Winter came softly with gray mornings and gentle rain. The hospital was busier than ever, but Laura handled it with calm. She had learned when to step away, when to rest, when to breathe. One evening, she walked out of the hospital after a long day. The air was cold, her breath visible in the dim light. Across the street, she saw a young woman kneeling beside an elderly man who had fallen. Laura ran over, instinct guiding her. "Is he okay?" she asked gently. The young woman looked up, panicked. "I think he fainted. I already called for help." Laura knelt beside them, checking the man's pulse and helping him stay comfortable until the ambulance arrived. When it did, she gave the paramedics a brief summary and stepped back. As they drove away, the young woman turned to Laura. "Thank you for helping. You seem so calm." Laura smiled softly. "I used to panic too. But you did everything right. You were brave." The woman smiled shyly, her eyes wet. "I just wanted to help," Laura nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes." As the young woman walked away, Laura stood there for a moment, watching the lights of the ambulance disappear down the street. The same feeling she had on that night and the night of the accident kept returned, but it felt different now. It wasn't fear. It was gratitude. She looked up at the sky, whispering softly, "Thank you." When she got home that evening, She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window again. The paintings on the wall glowed faintly in the light. She thought of all the people she had met, her patients, her friends, and Ethan, and how each of them had become a small piece of her healing. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan appeared. "The gallery invited me to do another show. This time they want to include your community group's work too. What do you think?" Laura smiled as she typed back, "I think it's perfect. Let's call it Second Chances." He replied with a simple heart emoji, and she laughed softly. Outside, the rain began to fall, steady, cleansing, alive. Laura leaned her head against the window, listening. Every drop felt like a reminder of how far she'd come. She thought back to that night on the dark road, when she had pulled a stranger from a car and thought she was saving a life. She hadn't known then that she was saving her own, that in helping someone else find their way back, she'd discover her own path to peace. The world outside blurred into silver, and she felt her heart quiet. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real, and it was hers. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. It had been almost 5 years since that night on the quiet road, the night that changed everything. Time had moved gently, reshaping both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Laura was still at the hospital, but her days looked different now. She had taken on a mentoring role, helping younger nurses find their footing. She no longer felt the same weight that once sat on her chest. Instead, she carried a kind of calm that came only from experience and from peace. The community center had grown too. The small art class Ethan started had turned into a full program called Light Within. They offered painting, music, writing, and simple workshops where people could just come and talk. What began as one man's recovery had become a space for many to heal. One afternoon, Laura received an email from the director of the center. "We're celebrating 5 years of Light Within. Ethan asked if you could speak at the event." She smiled as she read the message. Public speaking wasn't something she usually enjoyed, but this was different. This was family, a story that belonged to all of them. The day of the event arrived on a golden afternoon in early spring. The hall was filled with faces, old and new, familiar and curious. Paintings lined the walls and soft music played in the background. There was laughter, a hum of warmth that filled the air like sunlight through glass. Ethan was there too, busy helping set up displays. He looked older now, but in a good way, more grounded, more certain. When he saw her, he smiled, the same gentle smile he always had. "I was afraid you'd find an excuse not to speak," he said teasingly. She laughed. "I thought about it, but someone reminded me that stories only matter if they're shared." He nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "You've come a long way." "So have you," she said softly. When it was her turn to speak, Laura stepped up to the small stage. She wasn't sure what she would say until the moment came. She looked at the faces in the room, people of all ages sitting quietly, waiting. "I'm not used to standing here," she began with a smile. "Usually I'm the one running around in a hospital or sitting quietly in the back of a room. But today I wanted to tell you something simple. Sometimes we think saving a life means running into a fire or pulling someone from danger, but more often it's something smaller. It's listening. It's showing up. It's reminding someone, even yourself, that life is still worth living." The room was silent, everyone listening. "I met someone years ago who taught me that," she continued. "He reminded me that we can't always choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we show up afterward. Healing isn't about being perfect. It's about being real, and sometimes when we think we're helping someone else, we end up finding our own way home." Her voice trembled slightly at the end, but she didn't try to hide it. She smiled and stepped back, the applause filling the hall. Ethan met her as she walked off the stage. "That was perfect," he said quietly. "I was terrified," she admitted. He chuckled. "You didn't look it. You looked like someone who knows what she's talking about." After the speeches, they walked around the hall together. On one wall hung a new series of paintings, this time not just by Ethan. Each piece had been done by someone from the community. One was by a young man who had lost his brother, another by a mother recovering from illness. Every canvas carried a piece of someone's heart. "They're beautiful," Laura said, her eyes soft. "They're brave," Ethan corrected gently. "That's what makes them beautiful. A little girl ran past them laughing, her paint-stained hands waving in the air. She bumped into Laura and looked up wide-eyed. "Sorry." "It's okay," Laura said, smiling. "Are you an artist too?" The girl nodded eagerly. "I painted the one with the birds. My mom said birds mean freedom." Laura crouched down. "That's a good meaning." "I think you're right." The girl grinned and ran off again, her laughter echoing through the hall. As the evening went on, Laura and Ethan found themselves sitting outside under the soft glow of string lights. The air was cool, and the sound of the sea carried faintly in the distance. "Do you ever think about how different life could have been?" she asked quietly. "All the time," he said. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night." Laura shook her head gently. "Maybe someone else would have stopped." "Maybe," he said, "but it wouldn't have been the same. That moment, it connected us. It set everything in motion," she smiled. "Maybe it was meant to." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You know what I think now? I think we're all meant to save someone, even if it's just by being there." They sat in silence for a while after that, watching the lights flicker and fade as the night deepened. Weeks later, Laura started a new project at the hospital, a program that paired recovering patients with volunteers from the community center. She called it Bridge. The idea was simple: people healing, helping people healing. The first time they met as a group, Laura told them, "We all have stories. Some are painful, some are full of hope, but none of them are meaningless. Sometimes your story is exactly what someone else needs to hear." One of the volunteers, a young man with tired eyes, raised his hand. "What if my story isn't good yet?" Laura smiled kindly. "Then it's still being written." That answer stayed with him and with many others. Over time, the Bridge program became a quiet success. People found friendship, courage, and meaning in one another. Ethan often visited to paint with the patients. He would sit quietly, helping them express what words couldn't. Sometimes Laura would watch from the doorway, her heart full. It amazed her how far they had both come, not just surviving, but truly living. One day, Ethan came to her office with a rolled-up canvas. "I finished something," he said, handing it to her. She unrolled it carefully. It was a painting of two hands reaching toward each other, one offering light, the other catching it. "It's called Continuing," he said softly. "Because that's what this is. We don't fix people. We help them keep going." Laura stared at it for a long time, her throat tight. "It's perfect," she whispered. He smiled. "It belongs to you." She shook her head. "No, it belongs here, to everyone." She hung it in the hospital's main hallway the next day. It caught the light perfectly, glowing softly whenever the morning sun passed through the glass. Years later, people would walk by that painting and pause. Some would stop and smile. Others would whisper a quiet thank you without even knowing why. And sometimes when Laura passed it on her way to work, she'd catch her reflection in the glass, older, yes, but full of peace. She would think back to that night on the dark road, to the fear and the rain and the sound of someone breathing again. It no longer felt like a memory of chaos. It felt like the beginning of everything good, because it was. The world had moved on, as it always does, but pieces of that night still lived in her. In every person she helped, in every story shared, in every quiet moment of gratitude, and even now, after all the years and all the changes, she still believed one simple truth: when you reach out to save someone, you might just find your own life waiting in their hands.